Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the last FCW Bookshelf Live of the Acquire Show. I'm Troy Schneider, I'm the Editor-in-Chief of FCW, and really happy to have everyone here. And we have had a lot of great book discussions here over the last 2 days, but for anyone who's really interested in government technology, I think we saved the best for last. We have Bill Eggers here, who is the author of a new book, Delivering on Digital. And Bill has been covering the space for a long time. He's the executive director of Deloitte's Center for Government Innovation. He's written 8 books now, is that right?
This is actually my 9th.
This is 9, and has explored government reform on any number of angles. He wrote the definitive look at e-government, and wrote about this in FCW more than a decade ago. And so that may be a good place to start. The technology and the technology's potential in government is not exactly a new idea, but in some ways, this was supposed to be taken care of by eGov. For what happened? Why has it been hard, and why do you feel like there's a different potential this time?
Right. It is interesting. I think the article I had in FCW was 2002, 2003, but it was about everything that's possible to transform government through technology. And the epilogue to my book, which was called Gov 2.0, and that kind of coined that term, looked at 2 different futures for government. One is the very optimistic one, if government was able to take advantage of all the technologies, if we could dream enough and imagine enough the possibilities. And the other one was a little bit more pessimistic, that if we didn't act, and unfortunately in many respects the more pessimistic version took place. So why is that? What happened? Number one, the technologies just weren't there. Right. In some respects. That was before mobile devices, really. It was before cloud computing, it was before software as a service, and a lot of things that really make it much easier to do this now in this environment. Also skill levels. Back then, during the dot-com era, there weren't millions of people who had expertise in user experience and user illustration, service architects, and all sorts of web developers. So we didn't have that, but also citizens weren't necessarily demanding it. Very few citizens actually had an idea of just what kind of service you could get in the digital age. So it was very early. So I think, a lot of the things that those of us, I ran a eTexas initiative back then in government, and those are the things that a lot of us believe were possible are now starting to come to fruit, but because the environment, as I argue in this book, is much, much more hospitable, I think now, for digital government transformation to finally occur.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The technologies themselves have changed, but we didn't have Amazon or Uber or the Papa John's Pizza app to sort of explain, set expectations as to what's possible to move things forward. But agencies are making some progress in really delivering digital service at the federal level and at other levels. Could you talk a little bit about sort of what you're seeing today? How, if you were going to assess the landscape of digital government and the infrastructure that's there, how are we doing?
Sure. So we actually did a survey, 1,200 government officials in over 70 countries around the world. I think it's the most comprehensive survey. And that actually helped us to understand where governments were and kind of the digital maturity model. And it turns out that in terms of at the level of what we would call, very digitally maturing government organizations, was probably, about 15%. Mm-hmm. Not a huge amount.
15, 1.5, not 5.
1.5, yeah, 1.5. And then on the other end, which we'd say very early in developing, was more like a third, and then a lot of them kind of boxed in the middle somewhere. But we are seeing a lot of really interesting innovations around the world, some of which go even beyond some of what you might see in the private sector. I was just in Europe last week, and with a lot of the European officials, a lot of CIOs from the countries, and one of the countries that was there at the EU meeting was Estonia. Mm-hmm. Estonia is perhaps the most digitized government in the world today. Who would have believed it, right? But they started, they got their independence right around the internet age, and they were able to start from scratch. In Estonia, you can basically sign up for any kind of government service. You can register a business and get started working in the time it takes you to get a cup of coffee. And they have something called once only. which means that you only ever have to give your information to government at any level once. Once. And that's it. And there's a two-way street, so you actually have transparency into any government official that has looked at your data, your information, and if they were not authorized to, they could actually go to jail necessarily. So it's a two-way sort of street of transparency. And there's a lot of those sort of interesting innovations around the world that the book tracks.
Yeah. And how would you sort of assess we'll just stick at federal right now, the US federal government's effort compared to what Estonia is doing, or Denmark's done a lot of things in this space, and the UK obviously has been a place that digital service champions in the US have pointed to and looked at the government digital service. How are we ranking?
Well, I actually, when I talk about what I think are some of the most innovative central governments in the world, I think the U.S. is in the top, right? And that's post healthcare.gov. So the book opens with the story of healthcare.gov. And what was interesting was that my last book, one of my books, looked at over 100 big government initiatives since World War II. And the Washington Post asked me to write a piece, a big outlook piece, the day the bill was passed, looking at lessons learned from all of those initiatives and how do we avoid that this time. And obviously that wasn't avoided, but despite the disastrous launch, I argue that healthcare.gov ended up being the best thing that ever happened to digital government in the United States because it reprioritized digital government in a way that no congressional testimony, no big report, or anything else could ever do. It forced the President of the United States, every cabinet member, the Chief of Staff to understand how a website works, how government procures IT, what's wrong about it and what's not, and to really get into it in a way that few countries have done that. And then from there, we've seen a massive amount of change and innovation in a very short period of time.
I would have to foot stomp that is the editor of a publication that covers federal IT, to have the president on national television talking about IT acquisition. I was like, I was not expecting this. Now, you mentioned that one of the advantages with Estonia is they were able to start with a clean slate. They didn't have decades of analog systems that they were trying to digitize the existing cow paths.
Yes.
And with healthcare.gov, it was so bad and so important that the money and the resources and the senior attention was there. The other example that you use in the book is the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which also was sort of born digital.
Yes.
We can talk about CFPB in a little bit, but for the agencies that were not born digital and have legacy systems, legacy operations, legacy cultures, how do you move forward? Because you're not going to get a healthcare.gov infusion of cash. You can't just start with a clean slate. When you and your Deloitte colleagues go in, how do you help I don't want to name agencies and sort of put them out there as the analog agency, but an agency that has more legacy systems? How do you help them work through this?
Well, it is one of the more difficult issues yet. I think we learned a lot of lessons early on. So a good friend of mine, Mark Foreman, who was the first eGov czar, and Mark we talk about him in the book, I think brilliant individual, and he had it absolutely right, way back at the beginning of the Bush administration, which was with the federal enterprise architecture, and basically we're going to do common systems, we're going to do reusability, we're going to do commercial off the shelf whenever we can, and so forth and so on. And there's essentially, if you remember, over 24 big eGov projects which were supposed to consolidate all these systems into one. In the end, they only got 2 of them done, right? Only 2 out of all that. And I think one of the big lessons from that was, as Mark would say, rip and replace just didn't work at the time. And was also the level of ambition, which was such. Tony Summerlin, who's with the FCC now, Chief Data Officer, he said, a great quote where he said, you have to eat the elephant with a spoon, which means kind of you can't go after it all at once. And I think that we're coming to a real understanding that with the big legacy systems, what you want to be doing is, the most important thing is the data. So the agencies that are doing this well, I think, are looking at a data-centric approach, getting the data out, open APIs, and creating kind of a data lake, and then moving those into, whether it's like cloud-based systems, software as a service sort of systems, and then eventually you replace the other one. I think FCC is probably the best example of that right now. What David Bray, Tony Summerlin, and the team have been doing, where they literally, they've been able to close down over 100 legacy applications, move a lot of their systems onto the cloud by taking a different approach than we've seen before. Reusable systems, plug and play, and focusing on the data piece as opposed to just the application.
Yeah, well, and the fact that you talked about those only 2 of the big eGov projects happening. I had a conversation with Eric Heisen from DHS not too long ago, and he said, I guarantee you that if you have transformation, enterprise, and words like that in the name of your project, it's going to fail. And I think it's a valid point. And I think the way that the FCC, they were basically transforming the entire system,
right,
but they did it step by step by step. And you have this analogy of Death Star IT
right,
projects. I think is a great way of looking. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and why we should not be building more Death Stars in the federal government?
It's funny that back when a previous book called "If We Can Put a Man on the Moon" came out, I went into OMB very early on in the Obama administration, and Vivek Kundra was there, and he said, okay, you've looked at 100 of these initiatives, 20-something big IT initiatives. Talk to me about the ones that succeeded that were over $500 million. What did they have in common? And I said, I couldn't find any. Yeah. I literally couldn't find any at all. And because they became too complex, too complicated for any human being to even manage. And then you ended up with systems that took so long to get done that there's no one there from beginning to end. So it was just passing it on to the next person, hoping it didn't fail under your watch. And we've learned a lot from them. Obviously moving towards much more modular approaches. I think a great example is looking at what the FBI has been able to do with their Sentinel system. It's one of the ones that we looked at a number of years ago, and you had iteration after iteration failed and failed and failed, despite how important it was. And those are typical waterfall. We're going to do 10,000 requirements, figure it out, everything ahead of time, and then they got to the agents who just basically balked at it. And then they moved with Craig Foldham. They moved towards essentially an agile process, which is pretty risky for something that big, and people would say you can't do that with a system that big. And it's been very, very successful, because what happened was they said, we're never going to know ahead of time all the ways that our users are going to use them. So we're going to iterate on this, we're going to be agile and adaptive and so forth. And I think we need a lot more of that in government today. And I see a slow sort of movement. One of the barriers is that we probably have more people who know how to do agile projects in government than we have acquisition officers who know how to procure it.
Right. I was going to go there right now. You hear lots of reasons as to why government can't change, and sometimes it's not on the FAR, or I can't get my boss to approve it, or we can't do continuous delivery because we're providing vital government services and we can't roll out beta projects to our customers. Where are those real obstacles, and where is it people just need to change their mindset? Because people are doing modular and iterative development, but it's a common refrain.
Well, it's interesting because I hear that all the time too. And my good friend Steve Kellman, who's a FCW writer now and former head of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, I think probably one of the 2 or 3 leading procurement experts in our country. So recently he took a really hard look at Agile and then looked at all the FAR rules and everything else. And he also looked at what Mark Schwartz had been doing at Citizenship and Immigration Services, and said, well, does this all, is this all legal, and can you do it all? And he said, yes, you can, and a lot of what we think is not possible is actually increasingly. So I think the problem is that most people don't know how to do it. It's hard, and so if you're an acquisition official, you kind of reach into your toolkit for what you already know how to do. And so what USDS is trying to do now which is to create an acquisition workforce very proficient in digital, is I think the absolute right way to go. Similar to, so you've got a USDS model in acquisition, and I think you want to make it really sexy and interesting, so people want to go into that, and that make it very prestigious to be in there, because we can't get to where we need to go to if we just have a dozen or so people in the acquisition community who know how to do that sort of contract.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pushing on that a little bit, given that we are at the Acquire conference here, and there are examples where people are figuring out either how to do the training, and you mentioned 18F is working on this. There's been the Agile BPA. I think DHS and USCIS have done a pretty good job of figuring out how to contract for Agile. And are there other places you would point to that people should go looking for the kind of best practice examples to learn from? Sure,
and I talk in the book about the HHS Buyers Club, led by Mark Nager, and that's a great example of bringing together a community of people who are trying these innovative things, learning from each other, and saying, we're going to ask for prototypes. We're not going to just ask people to give us, 50-page RFPs back. We're going to start doing this differently, and we're going to be able to learn very quickly and adapt because a number of us are doing it all at once. And so I think that's a really good model. And it was probably 2 years ago or so, Mark had a conference and a big thing like this, and acquisition officials, his own community, bringing them together around this, and I think he had 500-600 people show up on that, and that's what you need. The lessons from some of the other areas of innovation in the federal government is that you need that cadre of people to get that innovation go quickly. One of the areas I talk about in the book is the prizes and challenges. 6 years ago, there's maybe 2 people in Washington even who knew how to do a prize model, a challenge model. Now, we've done over 600 in the federal government that are on challenge.gov. There's over 600 federal employees that have been involved in them, and there's probably about a couple dozen, is with Jen Gostetic, who was until recently kind of running this out of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, who actually are masters at it. And that's, I think, the sort of model that we need, where you've got a community of practice, more and more people coming in, a lot of train the trainers, and they're learning from each other.
Go a couple different directions here. I actually want to get a sense of who's in the audience. How many of you are government workers? Okay. And how many of you are directly involved in acquisition as your sort of core job function? Okay. How many are involved with technology and IT in general? Okay. So one question that I have is, what sort of expertise does government need to build up more of? Is it we need, customer experience designers and Node.js experts? Is it more digitally savvy acquisition professionals? Is it people who can be program and project managers and work with the contractors who are going to bring the actual technology chops? And I know at a certain level the answer is all of the above, but where are you seeing most of the effort being put forth, and where do you think we really need to beef things up?
So when we asked this question to government officials inside government, they basically said the most important thing were not actually specific technology skills, but a different mindset. Kind of an entrepreneurial, agile mindset is what we heard from people. And I think there is a lot to that. The digital mindset is just different than traditional organization mindsets. I mean, if you look at people that have come in through USDS, through 18F, that went into CFPB early on, a very different way of kind of thinking about the world. And it's all about kind of openness and open source and agility, an extreme user focus, a real big belief in transparency and so forth, non-hierarchical matrix sort of organizations. And and that mindset is important, I think, for doing digital well. And one of the things I think we're going to fail if we just create a number of very small digital units throughout the federal government and say, okay, it's up to you guys, you do it all. Mm-hmm. In today's world, everyone needs some amount of digital savvy. I have a piece in FCW today which looks at how do you upscale your workforce at scale? How do you say it's not hundreds but thousands of people, get them to a certain amount of digital savvy? And we look at a digital academy out of the UK government. Mm-hmm. And basically it's their Department of Work and Pensions. Their transformation leader came in and he said, you know what, I'm never going to be able to hire enough people to do this. And so I'm going to set up boot camps, and he sent them to these boot camps. There's now 3 the academies going through. They spend 6 weeks there, 3 to 6 weeks. They get trained in things like Agile, how to do user journeys, user experience, persona development, whatever they want to do. And then they get out of that, and they actually are kind of like what the Brits call plumber's mates. Think of it like apprentices, and then they go to work with someone who's more of an expert, sitting side by side with them, building different applications and so forth, and eventually kind of transitioning into a different role. Mm-hmm. And his goal is to get literally over 10,000 people in the organization through those boot camps. And that's a really interesting model. I will say one other thing about this. So, Deloitte, we've got very, very big consulting firm, 60,000 people, 7,000 in DC. We're training 1,000 of our consultants just in DC in human-centered design. Mm-hmm. Because we believe that's a core skill you need in today's world. And so a lot of them are going to General Assembly and learning that sort of thing. And it's really interesting when they come back from learning, they're really excited, people. And so I think there's an opportunity to do this. And it doesn't matter what age you are, what everything, but I think that's what we need to do is create that culture of continuous mm-hmm. learning.
Yeah, there's another example I would add to that another thing that you can find on FCW today, and you'd think we planned this or something, is a feature on a roundtable that we hosted with a bunch of digital service experts throughout government. And I'd encourage you to read it. It's a good piece that digs into a lot of these issues. But there's one example in particular that goes right to this, where I think it was Mike Kruger at Commerce, and he was saying that the biggest impact that he's seen was something not on his team, but colleagues elsewhere who had done real data training and trained thousands of people throughout Commerce on just the basics of how to use some of the the sort of data crunching technologies. And so, helping people who were subject matter experts learn a little bit of Python and to know how to do this. Not that they were going to become the developers, right, but to change their thinking and help them learn what questions to ask and where to ask for help. And I think that goes to the talent side, because if you say we need tens of thousands of digital experts and digital government experts, well, no one has the hiring authority to do that. And the other interesting thing that came out of that roundtable was a fairly frank discussion of executives from certain agencies telling the people from USDS and 18F, like, look, you come in and the message is, you career government people just don't understand. Let us help you because we understand this way of thinking. And that's definitely not the intent of USDS. It's like, no, let us teach, let us learn from each other. But how to train, how to coach people up, how to bring in new blood without creating this tension between career people who may be very open to thinking more digitally about it, but don't want to be told that they are the legacy workforce on things.
The cultural tension is, I'm always asked about this, and I've got a funny story. So 2 months ago, I spoke to a group of aspiring CIOs, kind of the deputy CIO types for the state of Pennsylvania. And mostly people 20 plus years in there, they're getting ready for their last step. And I was talking about, digital mindset and a lot of the millennials coming in. And I mentioned, some of them are going to come in and they might have, earrings in their nose, they might have orange hair, they might even be wearing hoodies. Mm-hmm. And one guy just got really upset and he said, we can't have a bunch of kindergartners running around here unsupervised who don't care about anything. And he just blew up. And then one by one, a lot of the other career people started giving stories about essentially millennials who are working for them, looked and acted differently, who were making such a profound impact. And then the next day, they had the second day of the training, half of the class showed up in hoodies. And I just said, you know what? And then the last thing was, as we look at because I think the dress code, it's actually an important thing. When you talk to our digital guys, it's really because it shows their creativity. The former CIO of Pennsylvania, Charlie Gerhards, was there, and he said he remembered a time, back when women were not allowed to wear slacks, to work. They weren't allowed to wear slacks, and he said that, and then they finally, a company I was working for, that was going to let them wear slacks, but it was, it was like a group of men that were going to decide what the dress code was for how they would wear slacks. And when you think about how crazy that is, I think we're going to look at this the same way 10 years from now. But, my big, one of the big things that came out of all the interviews I did in the book was that you have to adapt to them. Don't make them adapt to you, because they won't. They will leave. And so that means that one of the reasons why the USDSs and 18Fs in the world are a little bit off, or we have a digital studio, and for a while they're a little bit off from the rest of our organization, is because they have a belief set, a different culture, and you don't want to tug them into the center and make them like everyone else. What you want to do is start bringing the center of the organization closer to that edge over time, and that requires kind of a delicate balancing act.
I've been to your digital studio. You would never show up wearing that shirt and that jacket.
Oh, I would be. So when I interviewed one of the guys in the book, and it was really funny. I think I was wearing a jacket like this, and he said, he didn't think about it, but he said to me, yeah, when we see the suits coming in, we feel like we got to dumb it down a little bit. And I'm like, okay, thanks.
Yeah. But that goes to its good nature, but that goes exactly to the point that I raised of, agencies need to adapt to the digital talent that they want to attract and retain, but you also have to make sure that the digital talent understands and appreciates the expertise that's in the agency and the commitment to the mission, and because I do think that there's a fair number of friction points there.
No, absolutely. And so if you look at, I think people are learning, if you look at UK's government digital service, they'll go out there, they'll always have with the new techies coming in, they'll have a career person who understands the process and so forth. I think these boot camps where there's a lot of peer-to-peer training is important, because at least people have a certain common understanding. But on the other hand, so their perspective is that they're going to be radically slowed down, okay, if they have to then explain every step. So we have to figure out a way of doing that. Because I think as an example, so I was talking to someone the other day about a project where they're putting essentially a digital overlay over kind of a big waterfall system that's been done. And 7,000 requirements in this system, and so they're struggling because they come in and look at it from a digital perspective and from a user centricity, and they said 90% of those don't make it. They're not needed. They put all that complexity onto it, and it's actually taking away from the overall project. So there's always going to be some of that tension involved.
So we may have already covered it, but if it's not workforce and culture, what are the biggest challenges that you see that to government transformation right now? Where do we really need to be putting most of our pennies?
Well, it's funny you say pennies, because our survey showed that government officials think its budgets are a very, very big one. Political priority, political kind of leadership being another one. Certainly workforce and skills, legacy systems. We've talked about some of those challenges right now. I think we've got some good things going for us here in the U.S. and I was just in the Netherlands. And their big problem is they don't have the political leadership who cares deeply about this, who's presenting a vision out there. If you look at what happened here, the president himself closed a lot of the deals for the digital people who were recruited in. He spoke at South by Southwest, and he told the story of healthcare.gov in a very honest sort of a way, and then what happened afterwards. And so been able to, between him and Todd Park and Mikey Dickerson and others, been able to inspire, thousands of people, really, in many respects, to get involved. So that's something we really have going for us now. But there's a GAO report that just came out a few days ago, which basically said 3/4 of all government IT spending is on operations of legacy green screen kind of systems right now, and that's the biggest challenge, is getting some of that funding over to these more productivity, citizen-centric services.
Sure. I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for the audience, and you and we could talk here for a long time. So if you all have questions, just raise your hand, let me know. Yes, sir.
You alluded to this as a contracting acquisition forum. How do you, in this rapidly changing technocentric field, deal with the social goals of government contracting, which require, not just suggest, require recompetition every X years, or we limit how long the contract can be. And frequently what I've observed, just anecdotally, I don't know how prevalent it is, that is a major point, is that turnover and the technology transfer and the knowledge transfer from one contracting workforce to the next contracting workforce, while that's overlaid with a political overlay of our 4-year election cycle and our 5-year procurement cycle.
It's a good question, just for the video recording, make sure, and anyone else who couldn't hear it. Question of contracting requirements and the need to recompete, the need to do set-asides for small business, the social goals of government contracting, and how those sort of forced resets on contractor support for government how can that work when you're really trying to constantly iterate and build the knowledge and move forward?
Yeah, so the last time we had major procurement reform was back in the 90s, really during those were the Kelman reforms. I actually wrote about those in my first book. And so I think we're well due for it. I've been in a variety of forums with a lot of the kind of contracting experts who've been around a long time. And it's time again, because I think what's happened is government has gotten pretty far away from best practices in the private sector again, and that's what the procurement reforms were all about in the 90s, was because it's basically, it's just way too slow, the process. So a big goal of the administration is to get startups and get others, the best-in-class technology, more involved and work in federal government helping to solve problems. And the last thing they want to do is get involved in the procurement process. So they might work with a Deloitte of the world or someone else because, we know how to do it, but they don't want to go in there by themselves. So we have to fix that. And, it's a big problem in DoD now. It's a big problem elsewhere. It's the speed. It makes absolutely no sense in many respects in today's world because the technology moves so quickly. I also think that, we are though seeing some interesting models. What Mark Schwartz has been doing at Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is really interesting, kind of this flexible model where they've been doing what I call a bake-off, which is instead of just putting it all into one contractor and hoping it's going to work, they'll hire 4, essentially, and think of it like, and they'll all be doing agile sprints, essentially, and every 6 months he recalibrates who gets the different parts of the funding and who's doing what, depending on the performance. So it's almost a little bit like a horse race, but at the same time, they've got incentives so that they have to work together too. And what that does is that de-risks it dramatically from that one pick, because I think we have to move away from the blind marriage approach. We've talked about this for 20 years, and I think in some respects it's gotten worse. In some, you see these giant contracts which are just low cost, low bid, and I think the Death Star approach, which is these huge, giant sort of efforts which don't tend to work, moving away from that. So the way to deal with it is a lot more of that chunking and so forth, because as soon as now we start getting used to mobile and cloud and so forth, now we've got Internet of Things coming on and all the cognitive technologies and so forth. We can't continue to have a situation where we're always 10, 15 years behind the cycle.
And I do just want to hammer on the point about what's happened at USCIS and the way that they've contracted to try and allow for sort of, almost recompetes within the process and doing it on a task order by task order basis in a way that meets both the letter and the spirit of the FAR, and but does allow for that flexibility and doesn't have a situation where you're with Deloitte for a project and then you recompete and you switch to company X and they just then go try and hire a bunch of the Deloitte people, and that's the old way of the sort of body shop approach to contracting. I don't think it works here.
But it's funny, there's still a handful of projects that everyone talks about when there should be really hundreds.
Yes.
And how do we even pick among all these great ones?
Oh, we have to get.
Hopefully, we'll get there in a couple of years.
Have to get people to talk. You can always come talk to FCW about your project. So, yes, sir. Here in the middle.
So how common is it to have a what thing?
A grant? I'm sorry, just not hearing a grant off? Oh, okay.
Like a subset of procurement, maybe part of procurement, or having people who specialize with grants with IT.
I see. Just build in. And is the idea of like getting better coordination between IT and the acquisition, or the idea of having small grants to seed innovative projects? I just want to make sure I understand the question. Okay.
Yeah, So I think I know what you're saying, but I'm gonna talk about what I know here. But there's a lot of interest now in kind of this notion of almost government as VC model, venture capitalist sort of model, where you're playing a little bit of the role of looking at what are some of the technologies, what are some of the innovations, how do we grow some that we know what we need, DARPA, InQtel, IARPA, EARPA, and others. And I think there's definitely something important about that in today's kind of technology world. One interesting case was the Department of Energy did an innovative model where they have a big project where they're basically just trying to grow the use of solar around the country. It's called Project Sunshot, and essentially one of the things that they found was the plug-in costs of solar were very high, and that means like customer acquisition and other sort of things were 40% of the overall cost, compared to most industries less than 10. So they said we need to find a way of speeding that up because the market we believe might take too long. And so they did a really innovative model where they combined crowdsourcing and prizes and challenge to get it. What they did was they created a challenge, and they said out of 250, they picked like 20 to be most viable product to develop most MVPs, most viable products, minimum viable products. And then what they did was they gave each of them a $25,000 grant to top coder credit. And what that means, top coder is about 1 million different web developers, and they compete to develop various things for applications. And they figured out a way to make it a competition, very, very low cost, and you get it back very quickly. And so within 8 weeks, from beginning to end, afterwards, they ended up with 17 MVPs built by these organizations through a kind of a combination of, you would say, kind of a grant procurement prize challenge model. And I think we're seeing more and more of that. I would say, look at what NASA's doing around their kind of SBA and other areas. But that's a really good thing to bring up, because I think we're going to need to do more of that to get the kind of innovation we need into government.
Yeah. I saw another hand up. We may have answered that question. I want to, I want to go back to the money question. You said that people saw that, and there is the question of would the IT modernization fund really fix this? And I won't ask you to handicap the prospects of that. But is there a budget argument to be made? Is there real cost savings of bringing better digital solutions to bear, or is it really about delivering better service and transforming government? Again, I know it's both, but can you make the case on money that we save down the road, or should the real argument be, look how much better we can make government work for the citizen?
I think that, done well, it should be both. So if you look at the way to look at digitization is that you've got a lot of what government does is inherently digital, which means a lot of it is kind of paperwork factories. A lot of the agencies, that's a lot of what's actually done. That should be able to be 100% digital over time. And that's going to result in pretty dramatic cost savings, and then done well, also big service improvements, right? Because it's going to be quicker and faster for the user to do this. Now you have to have a real user centricity to it, right? We've got some countries that move towards 95, 97% digitized in terms of their tax filing. Mm-hmm. A lot of cost savings. In Europe right now, in Belgium and Estonia and other countries, basically you just go in and everything's pre-populated, and you just go in and say yes, 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 no, click, send. 10 minutes or so to do your taxes. And you can also imagine, what that does from reduction. So that's going to be a big cost savings, and we've seen it, in a variety of agencies. The state of Utah is probably one of the leading states on this. They've got 500 services which are digitized. They're moving very, very aggressively to kind of a model where they're closing down some of their physical sort of things. They're saving a couple $100 million a year. And then a lot of what else government does is physical, like transportation and a variety of things. And then there's a digital overlay over those. And that's where the opportunity is for real transformation, whether it's around transportation, healthcare, education, of completely reimagining what the model would look like. And there I think you're going to see more dramatic service improvement and making much more citizen, user-centric, personalized. Mm-hmm. But the lesson from, I think, FCC and closing down a lot of the legacy systems and moving it to the cloud, there was also very significant cost savings. I think it was over $100 million. And so if you look at it like a pyramid and the common processes and infrastructure down here where most of the spending is, what you want to do is get the bottom of the pyramid less wide and start moving that money up there for the productivity enhancing, citizen enhancing sort of services. And that's the model that's going to have to be driven. So I don't think we're going to see the sort of tens of billions of dollars for modernization, right, as coming straight from the budget.
Right. Yes, sir.
So, in listening to what you've been saying, kind of reading the foreground and the book that you've written, a couple of things I have a question about. Specifically, the workforces that are in place typically in the federal government are fairly historical. I'll use that as a safe word. It's an older workforce.
Right.
You've got a younger workforce that the government wants to attract so that they can have people. Right? The changes that you're talking about that you're predicting should be kind of pushed as objectives to keep us politically current, you're going to find a lot of resistance in that, I find, in working next to people that have been in the government 20 years, got family in the federal government, that dread training, right? How do you expect, or what is your position, I guess, on being able to bring in the tacit knowledge that's there and merge that with attracting the newer, younger knowledge, the newer, younger talent that you want to come in without losing that continuity of the center? Like how do you see that happening successfully?
Sure. Just for those who couldn't hear, just the question of the challenge of bringing in new talent without alienating the existing career workforce and making sure that the continuity and the knowledge transfer is there, that you don't bring in a bunch of new kids as the retirement tsunami takes 20 and 30-year veterans out without making it, at the very least, a smooth transition and not losing institutional knowledge in the process?
It's a great question. I mean, first of all, the millennials are the majority of the workforce now in America. They just surpassed baby boomers as the majority. What are they in the federal government now? About 7%, okay? And so the myth is that that's because millennials don't want to work for government. Well, we actually looked at the data, and that's not actually true. What it is that governments have not been hiring millennials in many respects. There's been hiring freezes, a variety of other sorts of things. And so you're going to end up with these massive gaps over time. And we saw this a little bit back with Gen Xers. So the first thing government needs to do is start just hiring a lot of millennials, which it has not been doing over time. And so you have this massive imbalance that you don't see in any other sectors today in terms of the age of the workforce. The second thing I think is that, you know, in many respects, the Gen Xers are going to be a bit of a bridge to that generation because they're starting to come into positions of power and leadership. And if you look at a lot of the CIOs and others, and they're kind of have a foot in both camps, I think, in many respects. And so they can serve as that bridge, and that's going to be really important. I see it, I see all this at my own company, right? At Deloitte, we're a very big organization. We've got a lot of millennials coming in, and they look at the world in a different way sometimes, and they want different. And so we're getting a lot less, I would say, stuffy about certain things, and creating a different environment, work environment, and making it, actually a place that people can feel creative and so forth. Trying to look at all the rules. We have something called Declutter, which is a massive project just to say, what are all the rules that we have now and everything else that is cluttering your life, that is making you feel less creative, less innovative, and how do we systematically get rid of those? And that's a lot of that's being led by the millennials in the organization. So I think there needs to be a lot more of empowering them and making sure that they feel like they can come into an environment, make a big difference, that it's, again, not going to be kind of stultified. A friend of mine is Ron Sanders used to be the head of human capital for the intelligence community. And back, that was after 9/11, so the intelligence community was seeing a massive growth in terms of recruitment, right? And a lot of people wanted to go in there. And so they were actually seeing, big parts of their workforce were under 30. And Ron used to always say that the big fight, the big race was to how quickly could they change the overall mindset and culture, or would the existing one bear down so much on them that they were going to leave? And Ron said this was kind of a race to the death in many respects. And I think that's the point, and it's going to be up to, in many respects, sometimes the bridging generation now, which is smaller, to do that, and I think to lead towards some, a different culture and a different environment that millennials are going to feel comfortable wanting to work in, because, they're very, very purpose-driven. But right now, many millennials are, instead of choosing government, they're going to social enterprises, nonprofits, and other places because they believe they can make a difference more quickly, and they're worried about the bureaucracy. And you know what? A good technologist, if you tell them the hiring process is going to be 9 months, they're just going to laugh at you, okay? That's a complete non-starter and a joke. And see, those sort of things have to be fixed.
Ma'am, you get the last question. So the question was, where are the digital service efforts being focused, whether it's citizen service or helping fix back-end systems for government employees, or more broad educational purposes and others, and then where one can find the best case studies?
Yeah, so first of all, in the best, there's a number of, the White House and 18F both have some great playbooks on digital services, and there's a lot of things. The book, actually, I think you all have a copy of the book. after the end of each chapter is a whole section called Cool Stuff that has links and it has all that. We also have a website up for the book called www.deliveringondigital, and there's 35 kind of mini case studies, and then they'll point you to where in the book, and there's 8 different playbooks, which big infographics that will say, okay, here's 18 ways to create things you can do to create a digitally savvy workforce. Here's how do you do digital delivery. Here's how to create cybersecurity. So I think a lot of that we tried to curate for you. It depends on the level of government. The federal government directly delivers a lot less services than our other levels of government, so there's a lot of kind of horizontal sort of things, but you can get down the city level and the state level, so much of digital is really that citizen facing. I think we are seeing it here. In terms of education and training of employees, I think that's an area where some governments are using interesting things like augmented reality. They're using really interesting tools, micro-learnings. Micro-learnings are where you basically you're learning how to do something. It might be prototyping, and instead of going to a 2-week course, you're basically getting 5 minutes a day in those learnings, which I think are interesting. So it really depends, but governments are also starting to do some using digital for recruiting in an interesting way. The Navy, there's a great video out there. The Navy was trying to figure out how do we get more cryptologists in. Well, that's a pretty specialized area. They figured out that many cryptologists actually are big augmented reality gamers. So they created an augmented reality game and as part of their recruitment process. So they gamified it. CFPB has done an interesting thing where they put a lot of developers and coders. I mean, what they like to do is search in the code to see how good it is. Like a car enthusiast might look under the hood at the engine, so they actually will hide their job placements in the code. And they say, if you're looking at this code, maybe you should come and work for us. Yeah. So it's been, I think it's being really creative. And I found a lot of those really creative, innovative things that governments are doing now. We need a lot more of that. Yeah. As we go forward.
Well, let me bring us home on that point. That the questions that you all are asking, these are the questions that FCW is trying to cover on a day-to-day basis. I'd encourage you to look, to our most recent issue, to what we're doing on the website day to day. We don't have the great inventory of case studies. I would steer you back to the book there, but we want to explore these questions, and that goes for the sister publication GCN too. On your chairs was something about the GCN Digit Awards, which is all about finding not just digital government examples, but just great projects in government IT, because one of the things we try and do is help find the stories of what's working or what problems need to be fixed in Agency A and share those stories with Agency B, C, and D. And to do that, we need your help. So please, look at what we're writing. We're trying to share the stories with you. But if you have good stories, please share them with us so that we can help help answer your question for other people throughout government. But really, you all have a copy of the book. You should take a look. It's a great resource for both the broad concepts and the specific examples. And Bill, thanks a lot for doing this.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you. Bye now.